I pull the 40-footer out of the yard at 11:14, which is already wrong, because the briefing said 11:30. But Keeley from scheduling handed me the keys early and told me the prior driver had left the air brake report on the clipboard, and I might as well get the pre-trip done while I had the light. I didn't argue. I've been with Metro Regional for 9 years, and I learned around year 2 that the path of least resistance with Keeley is forward. What I should have asked what I think about now, every night, while I'm sitting in my apartment with the television on and the sound off, is why the prior driver left a report at all. The 414 route has been out of service since 2019. I should back up. Metro Regional Transit operates 31 fixed routes in and around the city. Some of those routes run 20-hour service, some run peak only, and a handful are classified as dormant, meaning they still exist on paper, still have designated stops with signage, still appear in the route database, but haven't had a revenue vehicle assigned to them in years. Budget cuts, ridership decline, council votes the usual. The 414 was a night route. It ran from the downtown transit center out through the Brashear corridor, past the old hospital complex on Vine, through the Southgate residential grid, and terminated at a park-and-ride lot near the municipal boundary. 9.7 miles, 22 designated stops, round trip just under an hour if you hit the lights right. It ran from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., 7 nights a week, and it was one of the last true night routes the system operated before the 2019 consolidation pushed everything onto the trunk lines. I never drove the 414 when it was active. I was on the 30 and the 22 during those years, but I knew people who did, and none of them talked about it the way drivers usually talk about a route, the bad intersections, the regulars, the spots where you'd get boxed in by parked cars. The 414 drivers just did their shifts and went home. I remember thinking that was unusual, because night drivers are usually the most talkative. You drive alone in the dark for 6 hours and you come back to the yard wanting to tell someone about it. The 414 drivers never seemed to need that. Anyway, in October, the planning department initiated what they called a dormant route assessment. The idea was to physically drive each of the 12 dormant routes under approximate service conditions, correct time of day, correct stopping pattern, same vehicle class, and generate a report on road conditions, signage status, stop accessibility, and whether reactivation was feasible. I'd done 2 of these already. The 508 out near the airport fringe, and the 112 along the river. Straightforward work. You drive the route, you stop at every designated stop, you note the condition of the sign, the pad, the shelter if there is one, and whether the approach is still navigable. You don't pick anyone up because you're not in revenue service. The head sign reads training, and the doors stay closed. The 414 was my 3rd assignment. Thursday night, mid-October. Clear, about 42 degrees. I had the route map printed on the clipboard next to the air brake report, and the stops were highlighted in the system's GPS, so the automated announcements would still trigger, even though we were out of service. That's standard procedure for assessments. You want to confirm the ADA announcement system still recognizes the stops. I pulled out of the yard at 11:14, made the deadhead run downtown, and started the route at the transit center at 11:41. The first 3 stops were unremarkable. Signs present, pads intact, shelters removed on 2 of them, but the concrete footings still visible. I noted everything on the clipboard. The automated voice called each stop correctly. I drove at service speed, which is slower than you'd think you're supposed to approximate the actual experience, including the deceleration and pause at each stop even though nobody is boarding. Stop 4 was at the corner of Vine and Harwick, in front of the old hospital outpatient building. The building has been closed since 2021, and the block is mostly dark now except for a security light on the parking structure across the street. I slowed, pulled to the curb, and the automated voice said, "Vine and Harwick," the way it always does, flat and slightly too loud for an empty bus. I looked at the stop. The sign was still there. The pad was cracked but usable. No shelter. There was a woman standing at the sign. I noticed her the way you notice anyone at a bus stop, a shape under the sign, a coat, a posture. She was standing the way people stand when they've been waiting long enough to stop checking the road, not looking at her phone, not looking toward me, just standing with her weight on one foot, a bag at her side, her face turned slightly away. I want to be clear about something. People stand at defunct bus stops all the time. The signs are still up. If you don't know the route has been discontinued, or if you're using an outdated app, you might walk to the nearest sign and wait. It happens. Drivers on active routes near dormant corridors report it a couple of times a month, so seeing her there was not, in itself, strange. What was strange was the time. It was 11:47 on a Thursday night, and this was not a well-lit corner. The outpatient building was sealed. The nearest open business was a gas station 4 blocks south. There was no reason for anyone to be standing at that specific spot at that specific hour unless they expected a bus. I slowed to a full stop the way you do during an assessment. The doors stayed closed. The woman didn't look at the bus. I wrote on the clipboard, "Stop 4 sign present, pad cracked any corner, no shelter, 1 person waiting." I sat for the required 15 seconds. Then I pulled away. I watched her in the mirror as I left. She didn't move. She didn't turn to watch the bus go. She just kept standing there, weight on 1 foot, bag at her side. The next 7 stops were empty and unremarkable. Road surface deteriorated noticeably between stops 9 and 11, where the Brashear corridor passes under the rail overpass. I made notes. The GPS matched the map. The announcements fired correctly. Routine. Stop 12 was on Southgate Boulevard, in the residential grid. This part of the route runs through a neighborhood that was middle density in the 90s and has thinned out since. Small apartment buildings, some duplexes, a closed elementary school. Street lighting is adequate but not generous. I pulled to the curb and the voice said, "Southgate and Wren." There were 3 people at the stop. A man in a dark jacket, seated on the bench inside the shelter. A younger man standing a few feet away with his arms crossed. A woman older, maybe 60s, standing at the sign itself, holding a folded newspaper. The shelter was intact. That was my first thought professionally. I was noting it. Shelter present, good condition, bench intact, 3 persons present. I wrote it down. I sat for 15 seconds. The 3 of them stood and sat exactly the way people do when a bus pulls up and the doors don't open. The seated man looked at the doors. The younger man shifted his weight forward. The older woman took a half step toward the curb. The doors stayed closed because I was in training mode. I pulled away. This time I watched the mirror longer. The seated man sat back down. The younger man returned to his original position. The older woman took her half step back. They reset. That's the word that came to me. They reset. I finished the outbound run, looped at the park and ride, which was in worse shape than the report had predicted, significant root damage to the lot surface, and started the return trip. The 414 ran the same stops in both directions, just opposite sides of the street. The inbound stops were mostly in worse condition because they faced the less maintained side of each road. I made my notes. When I reached the inbound side of Southgate and Wren, the shelter on that side had been removed. The sign was still there. Nobody was waiting. When I reached the inbound side of Vine and Harwick, the woman was gone. I completed the run, returned to the transit center, deadheaded back to the yard, parked the bus, and filed my clipboard report in the scheduling office. Keely had left for the night. I put the report in her tray and went home. I didn't think about the people at the stops for the rest of the night. People wait at defunct stops. That's a known thing. The following Tuesday, I got a call from Keely, asking if I could repeat the 414 assessment. She said the GPS data from my first run had a gap between stops 11 and 14. The system hadn't logged my stop and wait at 12, 13, or 14 on the outbound. She wanted a clean data set. I said fine. I was off rotation that week anyway, and the overtime was welcome. I ran the 414 again on Wednesday night, same schedule. Pulled out of the yard at 11:20 this time. Started the route at 11:44. The first 11 stops were identical to the prior week. Same conditions, same notes. I was driving the same bus unit 2917, a 2016 Gillig, nothing special. Stop 12, Southgate and Wren. 5 people. The same man in the dark jacket, seated. The same younger man standing with his arms crossed. The same older woman with the newspaper. And 2 new ones, a teenage girl sitting on the far end of the bench, and a man in work coveralls standing behind the shelter, just barely visible in the edge of the shelter's overhead light. I stopped. I sat for 15 seconds. I watched them. They watched the doors. The doors didn't open. They reset. I wrote on the clipboard, "Stop 12 shelter present, good condition, 5 persons present." Then I crossed it out and wrote, 5 persons apparently waiting for service. Then I crossed that out too and just wrote the infrastructure notes and moved on. The thing I need to describe, because it matters, is how they were standing. I have been driving buses for 9 years. I have watched tens of thousands of people wait at stops. There is a body language to it that is completely universal. The periodic check down the road, the phone glance, the slight shift when a vehicle approaches that might be the bus. These people had all of that. Every behavioral cue was correct. The seated man's posture changed when my headlights hit the shelter, the same micro-adjustment every seated rider makes when the bus appears. The older woman turned her body toward the curb at exactly the right moment. The teenage girl reached down for a bag at her feet, a bag I hadn't noticed until she reached for it. Everything was right. Everything was perfectly, precisely right. And that's what made it wrong, though I couldn't have told you that at the time. I just felt it as a heaviness behind my sternum, a reluctance to look at the mirror as I pulled away. I looked anyway. They reset. I completed the outbound run and started the return. When I reached the inbound side of Southgate and Wren, the sign was there. No shelter on that side, as before. 6 people were waiting. Different people, different clothes, different ages, different postures. A man with a briefcase, 2 women together, one leaning on the other. A boy, maybe 12, in a school jacket. An elderly man with a cane. A woman in scrubs. They all watched the doors. I sat for 15 seconds. The doors didn't open. I pulled away. They reset. I drove the rest of the inbound run at exactly service speed, stopped at every stop for exactly 15 seconds, made my notes, and returned to the yard. This time, I didn't file the clipboard immediately. I sat in the parked bus for a while. The yard was quiet. The other buses were lined up dark. I could hear the compressor on Unit 2903 cycling, which meant someone hadn't shut it down properly, and I almost got up to deal with it because that's the kind of thing I do. I noticed maintenance issues and I addressed them, but I stayed in my seat. I was thinking about the people at Southgate and Wren, not about who they were or what they were doing there. I was thinking about the fact that on the outbound run, there had been 5, and on the inbound run, 42 minutes later, there had been 6. Different people, as if a different group was waiting for each direction, as if they knew the route. I filed the clipboard in Keely's tray. I wrote nothing unusual in the comments section. I went home. The GPS data from the second run was clean. Keely confirmed it by email the next morning, but she had a follow-up question. She asked why my dwell time at stop 12 outbound had been 31 seconds instead of 15. I checked my own memory against the note on the clipboard. I had written 15 seconds. I was certain I had counted, but the GPS said 31. I told her the stop had good shelter conditions, and I'd taken extra time to assess the bench. She accepted that. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also a lie. I hadn't taken extra time. I had sat there for exactly 15 seconds. I was sure of it. But the GPS is the GPS, and the GPS said 31. And I had learned over 9 years that when the data and the memory disagree, the system wins. Except the system had also lost the data from my first run. Stops 11 through 14, gone. And on my second run, the system had recorded an extra 16 seconds at stop 12 that I hadn't spent. I let it go. I had 3 more dormant routes to assess that month, and I did them all without incident. The 207 out past the college, the 45 crosstown, the 91 along the commercial strip, normal, empty stops, signage checks, infrastructure notes. No passengers, because there are never passengers on dormant routes. That's what dormant means. In November, the planning department sent a memo to all drivers who had participated in the assessment program. They wanted volunteers for a second round of runs, this time at higher frequency, 3 consecutive nights per route, to generate a more robust data set for the reactivation analysis. The pay was good. The shifts were voluntary. I signed up for the 414 again. I want to explain why. It wasn't curiosity exactly. It wasn't that I wanted to see the people at Southgate and Wren again. It was something more like responsibility. I had noted persons present at a stop on a dormant route, and I had not reported it through any channel other than the clipboard, which Keeley read only for infrastructure data. If people were regularly waiting at a stop that hadn't been served in 5 years, that was a ridership signal. That was relevant to the reactivation analysis. It was, in a straightforward professional sense, my job to document it. That's what I told myself. I'm telling you now because I want you to understand that the reasoning felt completely sound. It still does, in a way. The logic was clean. The conclusion followed from the premises. It's only the premises themselves that I'm no longer sure about. The first night of the 3-night block was a Monday in mid-November. Temperature had dropped 34 degrees, clear sky, no wind. I pulled Unit 2917 out of the yard and started the route on schedule. Stops 1 through 11, same as before. No changes worth reporting. The road under the rail overpass had gotten slightly worse. I made a note. Stop 12, Southgate and Wren, outbound. 8 people. I recognized some of them from before the man in the dark jacket, the older woman with the newspaper. Others were new. A young woman with a stroller, a man in a high-visibility vest, like a road worker. 2 teenagers sitting on the bench where the seated man usually was. He was standing now, near the sign, as if he'd given up his seat for them. 8 people, standing and sitting with perfect bus stop behavior, at 11:58 on a Monday night, at a stop that hadn't been served in 5 years, on a route that didn't exist. I stopped. The automated voice said, Southgate and Wren. The people looked at the doors. The woman with the stroller adjusted her grip on the handle. One of the teenagers pulled an earbud out. The doors didn't open. I sat there. The GPS would say I sat there for 15 seconds. I think it was longer. I think it was much longer. But I don't know anymore what my own time feels like at that stop. So I'll use the GPS number, even though I've already told you the GPS has been wrong before. I pulled away. They reset. On the inbound pass, Southgate and Wren had 11 people. Different group. More of them this time standing in a loose queue, the way experienced riders do when they know which door opens and want to be first on. A line. They'd formed a line. I completed the run and went back to the yard. This time, I didn't file the clipboard immediately. I sat in the driver's seat and opened the passenger side camera archive on the onboard system. Every bus in the fleet has interior and exterior cameras that record continuously during operation. The exterior cameras cover the right side, the curb side, the door side. If people were standing at stop 12, the camera would have them. I scrolled to the timestamp for stop 12 outbound. The footage showed the bus decelerating, pulling to the curb, stopping. The shelter was clearly visible. The bench was clearly visible. The sign was clearly visible. The stop was empty. I checked the inbound footage. Same thing. The bus pulls up, stops, waits, empty curb. No one. I watched both clips 3 times. I checked the timestamps against the GPS log. Everything matched. The bus was at the right stop at the right time. The camera was functioning. I could see leaves moving on a tree, a plastic bag shifting in the gutter, the reflection of the bus's own lights on the shelter glass. The camera was recording the real world. The real world did not contain any people at Southgate and Wren. I had watched them. I had watched 8 people on the outbound pass and 11 on the inbound. I had seen the woman's hand on the stroller. I had seen the teenager remove an earbud. I had seen the line form. The camera had seen an empty stop. I filed the clipboard. Infrastructure notes only. I went home. I didn't sleep well, but I didn't not sleep. I lay in that middle space where your body rests, but your mind replays. And what it replayed was not the empty footage or the standing people, but the specific moment when the teenager pulled the earbud out, his left ear. He'd pulled it out with his right hand, reaching across. It was such a small human gesture. Nobody invents that detail. Nobody hallucinates the crossbody reach. Tuesday night, second of 3 runs. I decided to do something different. Not dramatically different. I wasn't going to call anyone or report anything or refuse the route. I was going to do my job exactly as assigned. But at stop 12, I was going to open the doors. This requires some explanation. In training mode, the doors are software locked. You can override the lock with a maintenance code that every driver knows, because sometimes during training runs, you need to physically inspect the door mechanism or the wheelchair ramp deployment. It's not a secret code. It's not a violation. It's a documented procedure. I would open the doors at stop 12, visually inspect the ramp, well the way you do during a maintenance check, and in doing so, I would see what happened when the doors opened for the people who were or were not standing at the stop. I am aware of how this sounds. I'm aware that I was constructing a procedural justification for something that was not procedurally motivated. But that's what 9 years in a system does to you. It gives you the language to make anything sound like policy. I'm not proud of it. I'm not ashamed of it either. It's just what I did. I pulled out of the yard on time, ran the route. Stops 1 through 11, normal. The night was colder, 29 degrees. I could see my breath when I cracked the window at stop 7 to check on a loose sign bolt. Stop 12, Southgate, and Wren. 12 people. The group had grown again. I recognized the regulars, the man in the dark jacket, the older woman, the younger man with his arms crossed. The rest were new, more of them now standing in the loose Q formation. A man near the back of the line was holding a transit pass in his hand, the way riders do when they want to board quickly. An older woman near the front had her fare card out, pinched between 2 fingers, arms slightly extended. They had fare cards. I stopped the bus. The automated voice announced the stop. I entered the maintenance override code. The doors opened. Cold air came in. I could feel it immediately, the temperature differential between the heated bus interior and the November night. The doors were open. The step well was illuminated by the interior lights. The ramp was stowed. Everything was mechanically normal. The 12 people did not board. They didn't move at all, at first. Then, slowly, the way a group adjusts when the situation changes, they shifted. The man in the dark jacket, who had been seated on the bench, stood up. The older woman with the newspaper took her half-step toward the curb, the same half-step I'd seen before. The man with the transit pass raised it slightly higher. They were ready. They were waiting to board. The door was open, and they did not step forward. I sat there with the doors open for what the GPS would probably call 15 seconds, and what I experienced as a long, still minute during which the heater fought the cold air. And the 12 people stood at the curb in perfect boarding posture, and nobody moved. Then the man in the dark jacket looked at me. Not at the doors, not at the bus, at me. Through the windshield, past the fare box, directly at me in the driver's seat. He had a face I couldn't describe then, and can't describe now. Not because it was strange, but because it was so ordinary that it refused to become a memory. He looked at me the way a regular rider looks at a driver who's running late. Not angry, not impatient, just acknowledging. You're here. I see you. We both know how this works. Then he looked away, and the 12 of them stood there, and I closed the doors and pulled away. In the mirror, they did not reset. Not this time. They stayed in boarding formation. The man with the transit pass kept his arm raised. The older woman kept her fare card out. They stayed ready, even as the bus pulled away, as if the stop was still active, as if I'd be back. The inbound pass at Southgate and Wren had 14 people. I opened the doors again. The same thing happened. They arranged themselves to board. They did not board. A woman near the front of the line, young, maybe mid-20s, wearing a coat I recognized as the kind they sell at the outlet mall on Route 9, looked at me the same way the man in the dark jacket had looked at me. Direct, patient, not pleading, acknowledging. I closed the doors and completed the run. Back at the yard, I checked the cameras again. Both stops, outbound and inbound, empty. The footage showed the doors opening on an empty curb, staying open, then closing. No people, no movement. Just the night and the stop and the bus. I did something I hadn't done before. I pulled the audio feed. The exterior microphone on a Gillig 2016 records continuously, along with the cameras. If 12 people were standing at a bus stop shuffling, breathing, the rustle of coats, the click of a fare card, the microphone would pick up ambient sound. The audio at stop 12 outbound was bus idling, door mechanism, heater fan, nothing else. The audio at stop 12 inbound was the same. Bus idling, door mechanism, heater fan. Then, underneath the heater fan, and I listened to this 4 times, to be sure a sound that might have been wind and might have been something else. A low, steady, undifferentiated tone, like air moving through a space that was shaped to produce exactly that note. It lasted for the duration of the door open period and stopped when the doors closed. I couldn't tell if it was coming from outside the bus or from the bus itself. I saved the clip to my phone. When I played it back in my car in the parking lot, it was just heater fan. Wednesday night. Third and final run of the assessment block. I want to describe the drive to the yard that night because it's important for understanding what I did next. It was a 12-minute drive from my apartment. I took Grant Avenue to 4th, turned south, past the closed bookstore and the laundromat and the church parking lot, and turned into the transit yard at the maintenance entrance. I had driven this exact route hundreds of times. I knew every light cycle, every pothole, every driveway where someone might back out without looking. It was the most routine drive of my life. That night on Grant Avenue, 3 blocks from the turn onto 4th, I passed a bus stop, an active stop Route 30, which I'd driven for years. There was a woman standing at the sign. She was wearing a coat from the outlet mall on Route 9. She was standing with her weight on one foot, a bag at her side. Her face turned slightly away. She was holding a fare card pinched between 2 fingers, arms slightly extended. I was in my personal car. I was not driving the 414 or any bus. I was 12 minutes from the yard and 3 hours from the start of the route. And the woman at the Route 30 stop was standing in exact boarding posture, holding a fare card, at 10:15 on a Wednesday night. When the Route 30's last run had passed that stop at 9:48, she was waiting for a bus that had already gone. I drove past. I looked in the rearview mirror. She didn't move. She didn't look at my car. She stood there holding her fare card, waiting. I want to tell you that this frightened me, but that's not accurate. What I felt was recognition. Not of her, I couldn't see her face clearly, and the coat from the outlet mall is the most common coat in the city. What I recognized was the posture, the patience, the absolute certainty that the bus was coming, held in the body like a physical fact, like gravity. I had seen it at Southgate and Wren, and now I was seeing it on Grant Avenue, and the difference between the two was that Grant Avenue was real. Grant Avenue had cameras that would show a woman. Grant Avenue had other cars that would see her. Grant Avenue was 3 blocks from my apartment, and I drove it every day. I arrived at the yard. I did my pre-trip. I pulled Unit 2917 out and started the route, stops 1 through 11. Normal. I made my notes. I drove at service speed. Stop 12, Southgate and Wren, outbound. I counted them this time. I counted carefully, starting from the left side of the shelter and moving right, the way you count a full bus during a passenger audit. 23 people. The shelter couldn't hold them all. They spilled out along the curb in both directions, forming a line that extended past the shelter's footprint. Some of them were sitting on the curb. Some were standing in the street. The man in the dark jacket was in his usual spot on the bench, but he was pressed against the side panel now, making room. The older woman with the newspaper was near the front of the line. The teenagers were further back. The man in coveralls was leaning against the signpost. 23 people at a dead stop on a dead route at midnight on a Wednesday in November, standing in perfect formation, holding fare cards and transit passes. A few of them had transfers, the little paper slips we stopped using in 2022 when the system went fully digital. They were holding transfers. I stopped the bus. The voice announced the stop. I entered the maintenance code. The doors opened. They arranged themselves. The line tightened. The front of the queue moved forward to the edge of the curb, exactly the way riders do, with that practiced lean that says, "I am about to step up." None of them stepped up. The man in the dark jacket looked at me. The older woman looked at me. The young woman in the outlet mall coat looked at me. One by one, down the line, they looked at me, and each look was the same. Not desperate, not angry, not confused. Patient, expecting. The way you look at a driver when you know the route, when you ride it every night, when the bus is yours, and the driver is yours, and the whole system exists to carry you from here to there, and you trust it absolutely. They trusted me. I sat there with the doors open, I don't know how long. The GPS would have a number. I don't trust the number. Then I did something that I have not been able to explain to myself since, and that I am only telling you because the point of telling any of this is to be accurate, even when accuracy makes me sound like someone you shouldn't believe. I said, Southgate and Wren. Inbound connections available at the transit center. I said it out loud. I said it in my bus voice, the voice every driver develops for announcements. Slightly louder than conversational, slightly flattened, professional. I said the words that a driver says when the automated system fails and you have to announce the stop manually. I don't know why. I wasn't thinking. The words were just there, in my mouth. The way a word is there when you've said it 10,000 times and the situation calls for it and your body does the work before your mind can intervene. The man in the dark jacket stood up from the bench. He walked to the curb. He stepped onto the first step. He was on the bus. I could see him not in the mirror, not on a camera, not in peripheral vision. I was looking directly at him. He was standing on the first step of Unit 2917, one hand on the grab bar, the other holding a transit pass. He was wearing a dark jacket, zipped to the neck. His shoes were wet. His face was still ordinary, still impossible to fix in memory. He looked at me the way you look at a driver when you've just boarded, brief, automatic. A nod that isn't quite a nod. Then he stepped past the fare box and walked toward the rear of the bus. I heard his footsteps. I heard the seat cushion compress. He sat down in the fourth row, left side, window seat. The older woman stepped on next. Then the younger man. Then the woman with the stroller, who folded it one-handed the way mothers do, a gesture so practiced it's almost unconscious, and carried it up the steps. One by one, the 23 people at Southgate and Wren boarded the bus. I heard every footstep. I felt every shift in the bus's weight as they moved down the aisle. They sat down, some by the windows, some on the aisle, a few standing and holding the overhead bars. The automated passenger counter above the door registered 0. The weight sensors in the floor registered only the driver. The camera, I would later confirm, recorded an empty bus, but I heard them. I heard coats rustling. I heard someone cough, a dry, polite cough, the kind you make on a bus because you're aware of other people. I heard the stroller wheels click against the floor. I heard a teenager's earbud leak a thin line of music, something with a beat, something current, something I almost recognized. I closed the doors. I released the brake. I drove. I drove the route. I announced every stop, out loud, in my bus voice, because the automated system was announcing them too, and the sound of both the flat recorded voice and my own layered over each other and filled the bus with the exact acoustic texture of a normal service run. I stopped at every stop. I opened the doors. At stops 13 through 22, no one was waiting. No one got off, either. My passengers rode the full outbound route, silent except for the small sounds that passengers make, and I drove them to the park and ride at the end of the line. I stopped the bus. I opened the doors. I said, "End of the line, park and ride. Please check for personal belongings." I heard them stand. I heard them gather bags and adjust coats. I heard them file toward the front, the way riders do on a bus that's reached its terminus orderly, unhurried, slightly stiff from sitting. The man in the dark jacket was last. He stopped on the step, one hand on the grab bar, and looked at me again. The same look, patient, acknowledging. I said, "Have a good night." Because that's what I say. That's what I say to every last rider on every last run, every night. I've said it for 9 years. The words are automatic. They are part of the job the way the brake check is part of the pre-trip and the route map is part of the clipboard. He stepped off. I watched them walk across the park and ride lot, 23 people, dispersing the way riders disperse, some toward cars, some toward the sidewalk, some toward the residential streets beyond the lot. The woman with the stroller unfolded it and set a child in it. I hadn't seen a child board, but she set a child in the stroller and walked toward the crosswalk, and the child's hand was visible above the rim of the stroller, small fingers catching the light from the parking lot lamps. I sat in the empty bus at the end of a dead route and listened to nothing. Then I started the inbound run. At every stop on the return, people were waiting. Not the same people, different faces, different clothes, different ages. Some stops had 2 or 3. Some had 1. Stop 18 had 9. They all stood in boarding posture. They all had fare cards or passes or the old paper transfers. When I opened the doors and announced the stop, they boarded. They sat down. They rode. By the time I reached stop 12, inbound Southgate and Wren, the opposite curb, I had 19 passengers on the bus, according to my own eyes and ears. I had 0, according to every electronic system on the vehicle. 7 people were waiting at the inbound stop. I opened the doors. They boarded. 26. Total. I completed the inbound run. At the transit center downtown, I announced the terminus. They filed off. The man in the dark jacket was not among them. This time he'd gotten off at stop 9, where the Route 22 used to connect. He'd stepped off and walked toward the shelter at the Route 22 stop, the active Route 22, which still ran a limited night service. He was going to transfer. He was using the transit system the way it was designed to be used, the 414 to the 22, the same connection that would have existed if the 414 had never been discontinued. I deadheaded back to the yard. I parked the bus. I sat there for a long time. I checked the cameras. Empty. I checked the audio. Bus noise, heater fan, and underneath so faint I had to hold my breath to hear it, the layered murmur of a bus carrying passengers. Not words, not coughs or rustles, just the aggregate sound of occupied space, the acoustic difference between an empty vessel and one that carries people. It was there, and when I saved the clip and played it on my phone, it was not there. I filed the clipboard. In the comments section I wrote, Route 414 assessment complete. 3-night block, all stops surveyed. GPS and ADA systems functional. Infrastructure report attached. Recommend further evaluation of road surface between stops 9-11 and lot condition at terminus. Under the line that asked, additional observations, I wrote, high potential ridership demand at multiple stops along corridor. Reactivation recommended. I don't know why I wrote that. I know exactly why I wrote that. The 3-night assessment block was over. My obligation to the 414 was complete. I should have gone back to my regular rotation, filed my reports, and moved on. The planning department would compile all the assessment data and make their reactivation recommendations, and whatever happened to the 414 would happen through normal channels. Instead, on Thursday night, one night, after the assessment block ended, I drove my personal car along the 414 route at midnight. Not the whole route, just the Southgate section. I drove slowly, under the speed limit, with my window down despite the cold. Stop 12. Southgate and Wren. Empty. No one at the shelter. No one on the curb. The shelter light was on, casting its usual circle of yellowish light on the bench in the pavement. An ordinary empty bus stop at midnight on an ordinary night. I drove past and continued along the route for a few more stops. All empty. I looped back and drove past stop 12 again. Still empty. I went home. I sat in my kitchen with coffee and thought about what I was doing, and what I concluded was this. They weren't waiting for a car. They were waiting for a bus. Specifically, for the 414. For the route, the vehicle, the doors, the voice that announced their stop. They weren't standing at a geographic location. They were standing at a point on a system, and the system had to be active for the point to exist. This thought should have made me feel better, because it meant the phenomenon was bounded. It didn't follow me. It didn't appear in my home. It wasn't in my car, or my kitchen, or my dreams. It was at the stops, on the route, during service hours, and only when a revenue vehicle or something that functioned like one was running the line. It should have made me feel better. What it actually did was make me feel responsible, because if they only existed when the bus ran, and the bus only ran when I drove it, then I was the reason they were standing in the cold at midnight waiting for doors that might not open. I was the service. Without me, the stop was empty. Without me, they weren't waiting. I had activated something by running the assessment, and every time I ran the route, more of them came, and every time I didn't, they what? Stood there in some kind of suspended patience? Dispersed? Ceased? I didn't like any of those options. The following Monday, I went to Keely's office during the day shift, which I never do. She was surprised to see me. I asked her about the 414 reactivation timeline. She said the planning department was still compiling data, but the preliminary numbers looked unfavorable. Low projected ridership, high infrastructure, repair costs, budget pressure from the council. She said realistically the 414 was 2 to 3 years from even a pilot reactivation, if it happened at all. I asked if there was any way to run additional assessment trips. She asked why. I said I wanted to refine the infrastructure data, that I thought the road conditions were changing week to week and a single 3-night block wasn't sufficient for an accurate report. She looked at me for a moment. Keeley has been in transit scheduling for 20 years, and she can see through procedural language the way I can see through traffic, and she said she'd approve 1 additional run per week, through the end of the year, subject to vehicle availability. 1 run per week, every Wednesday night. I ran the 414 the following Wednesday. I pulled Unit 2917 out of the yard and started the route at 11:40. Stops 1 through 11 were empty and unchanged. At stop 12 outbound, 31 people were waiting. 31. The line extended well past the shelter in both directions. Some of them were people I recognized, the man in the dark jacket, the older woman, the teenagers. Most of them were new. A man in a suit, briefcase between his feet. A woman with 2 children, both in pajamas, both holding her hands. A group of 3 young men who looked like they'd come from a shift somewhere, grease on their hands, boots, the tired camaraderie of coworkers at the end of a long night. I opened the doors. I announced the stop. They boarded. 31 people filled the bus to about half capacity. They sat and stood in the normal distribution seats, filling from back to front, standees near the rear door, a few in the articulated section. The woman with the 2 children sat near the front, in the seats marked for priority riders. The children pressed their faces to the window, the way children do on any bus, any night. I drove the route. At stop 15, the man in the suit stood and moved toward the rear door. I stopped. I opened both sets of doors. He stepped off. I watched him walk toward a darkened office building on the corner, and he walked the way a commuter walks, keys already in hand, head down, trajectory fixed. At stop 17, one of the young men in work clothes got off. At stop 19, the older woman got off, and so did a man I hadn't particularly noticed during boarding. At the terminus, the rest filed out. The woman with the children was among the last. The smaller child was asleep in her arms now, head on her shoulder. She maneuvered down the steps with the practiced awkwardness of someone who does this regularly, shifting the child's weight to free one hand for the grab bar. I said, "Have a good night." She didn't look at me. She stepped off and walked toward the lot. The inbound run was the same. Different passengers at each stop, boarding in 1s and 2s and small groups. They rode. Some got off at intermediate stops. Most rode to the transit center. The man in the dark jacket was at the inbound stop 12 again. He boarded, sat in the 4th row, window seat, and rode to stop 9, where he got off and walked toward the Route 22 shelter. He did this every time. His routine was fixed. His transfer was fixed. He was a regular. I completed the run, returned to the yard, checked the cameras, empty, checked the audio bus noise, and the faintest ghost of occupied space beneath it, and filed the clipboard with infrastructure notes and the same recommendation. High potential ridership demand. Reactivation recommended. This continued through November and into December. Every Wednesday night, I ran the 414. Every Wednesday night, the ridership at Southgate and Wren grew. Not just at stop 12, the other stops were filling in too. Stop 4 at Vine and Harwick, which had only ever had the 1 woman, now had 3 or 4. Stop 8 had a regular, a man with a lunchbox who boarded outbound and got off at stop 14. Stop 18 inbound had a group of older women who appeared to know each other, who sat together in the back and made the small sounds of conversation without producing any words I could distinguish. By mid-December, I was carrying between 40 and 60 passengers per run. The bus was full. The aisle was crowded during peak boarding at stop 12. I was making all the professional adjustments a driver makes when ridership is heavy, pulling tighter to the curb, pausing an extra beat at the doors, watching the mirrors during boarding, calling out for passengers to move to the rear. I was driving a full route. I was doing my job. One Wednesday, the week before Christmas, something happened that I haven't told anyone until now. I was on the inbound run, between stops 14 and 13. The bus was carrying about 50 passengers. The heater was working hard. The windows had fogged slightly in the way they do when a bus is full of breathing bodies. A passenger had pulled the stop request cord. The stop request cord is a physical wire that runs along the interior of the bus. When a passenger pulls it, a chime sounds, and a sign lights up at the front that says "Stop Requested." It's a mechanical system. Pull the wire, close the circuit, trigger the chime. The chime sounded. The sign lit up. A passenger, one of my passengers, one of the people who didn't register on any electronic system, who didn't appear on camera, who had no weight and no heat signature and no measurable presence, had pulled a physical cord and closed a physical circuit. I stopped at the next stop. I opened the doors. A man got off. The sign went dark. I sat there for a moment after the doors closed. The chime had sounded. I had heard it. It was on the audio recording. I checked later. The chime was on the recording. A clear, clean chime, the same chime that sounds 100 times a night on every bus in the fleet. And next to it on the audio track, nothing. No voices, no footsteps, no rustling, just the chime, in silence, as if the wire had pulled itself. But the wire can't pull itself. It's a mechanical system. It requires physical force. Something in my bus had exerted physical force on a wire, and the only things in my bus, according to every instrument, were me and the air. I finished the run. I went home. I sat in my kitchen, and I did not drink coffee, and I did not turn on the television. I sat in the dark, and I thought about the chime. Here is what I understood. The passengers were becoming more real. Not to the cameras, not to the GPS, not to any recording system, but to the bus itself. They could pull the cord. They could fog the windows. The seats compressed under them. I could see the dents in the cushions after a run, though they faded within minutes. They were heavier now than they had been in October. Not physically heavier, more present, more embedded in the infrastructure. As if every time I ran the route, they settled a little deeper into the system, became a little more integrated with the vehicle and the stops and the fare structure. They were becoming riders. I should have stopped. I should have told Keeley I was done with the 414 assessments, taken my regular rotation, and never driven Southgate Boulevard again. I know that. I knew it then. But here is the thing I need you to understand, because it's the thing that determines everything that happened next. I was a good driver. I had a clean record, 9 years of service, passenger commendations, a defensive driving certificate, and a professional identity built on the idea that when people stand at a stop, a driver comes. That's the job. That's the entire job. You drive the route. People wait. You open the doors. They board. You take them where they need to go. Everything else, the paperwork, the maintenance checks, the scheduling is infrastructure. The core act is, they wait, and you come. And they were waiting. In January, Keeley called me into her office. She had a strange expression, not concerned, exactly, but careful. The way she looks when she's about to deliver news she's already decided how to frame. She said the planning department had flagged my 414 assessment reports, not because of anything I'd written. The infrastructure notes were thorough and professional, but the repeated recommendation for reactivation, combined with the weekly run requests, had caught someone's attention. She asked me, directly, "Marcus, is there something about this route?" I said, "It has ridership potential." She said, "Based on what?" "Your assessment data shows 0 passenger contacts." I said, "The data doesn't capture everything." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said something that I think about now more than almost anything else in this whole account. She said, "I pulled the original service records for the 414 before it was discontinued. Do you know what the average nightly ridership was in its last year of operation?" I said no. She said, 12 to 15 passengers per run, mostly between stops 8 and 20. The heaviest boarding was at Southgate and Wren. She let that sit. Then she said, "The route was discontinued because ridership dropped below the viability threshold. It didn't drop to 0. It dropped to 12 to 15 per night, which is below our minimum for night service. Those people didn't stop needing to get where they were going, Marcus. We just stopped taking them. I didn't say anything. She approved. My assessment runs through March. February. The 414 ran every Wednesday night. Ridership, my ridership. The ridership that no instrument could see stabilized at around 65 to 70 per round trip. I knew some of them by sight the way you know any regular. The man in the dark jacket, who boarded at 12 and transferred at 9. The woman with the stroller, who boarded at 12 outbound and got off at 20 with the child asleep. The workers in boots, who got off at stops along the commercial stretch. The older women who sat together in the back. I began to notice patterns in their boarding and alighting that matched the original 414 service pattern. The heaviest use was in the Southgate residential grid, exactly where Keeley's record said it had been. The riders who boarded at stop 12 and rode to the end were reverse commuters, people who lived in Southgate and worked at the park and ride fringe, where the light industrial zone is. The inbound riders were coming from that fringe back into the residential grid. It was a commuter pattern, a working route, a transit line doing what a transit line does. I started keeping a mental log of the regulars. Not names, they never spoke to me, and I never spoke to them except in the standard phrases of the job. But I tracked their patterns. The man in the dark jacket was 5 nights a week, outbound only, always transferring at 9. If I'd been filing ridership reports, he'd have been flagged as a daily commuter. The woman with the stroller was 3 nights a week, outbound, always to stop 20. Part-time schedule. The workers boarded together and got off together. Shift workers. They were living a transit life. Boarding, riding, alighting, transferring. They had destinations. They had schedules. They had the small, exhausted patience of people who depend on a system they didn't design and can't control. I knew that patience. I saw it every night on the routes I drove in revenue service. It looks the same whether the person is visible to a camera or not. In late February, something changed. I was on the outbound run, approaching stop 12. I could see the group from 2 blocks away, the shelter light, the cluster of shapes, the line extending along the curb, 70 or more. As I got closer, I saw something I hadn't seen before. A second bus was approaching from the opposite direction. It was on the inbound lane, heading toward me, which was correct. Southgate Boulevard is a divided road and the inbound stops are on the far side, but there was no inbound bus at that hour. I was the only vehicle running the 414. There was no other bus. It was a Metro regional bus. I could see the livery blue and white, the same livery as Unit 2917. It was running with its headlights on and its interior lights on, the way a bus runs in service. I could see the head sign. It read, 414 Southgate. It pulled up to the inbound stop at the same moment I pulled up to the outbound stop. We were directly across the boulevard from each other, 2 buses at 2 stops, like a perfectly timed service pair. I looked across the road. The other bus had a driver. I could see the shape of someone in the driver's seat, a silhouette against the interior lights, hands on the wheel, the posture of a working driver. I couldn't see the face. The other bus opened its doors. People at the inbound stop, I hadn't noticed them before because I'd been focused on the outbound group stepped on. I could see them boarding through the bus's windows. I could see them moving down the aisle. I could see them sitting down. My passengers boarded my bus. The other passengers boarded the other bus. 2 buses, 2 loads, 2 directions. Running the 414 on a Wednesday night in February, like it was 2018. And the route had never been discontinued. The other bus pulled away first. I watched it go, heading inbound toward downtown. Its taillights shrank down Southgate Boulevard and turned left on Vine, following the exact route. I tracked it in my mirrors until it was gone. I drove my outbound run. At the terminus, my passengers got off. I started the inbound. At every stop, the usual inbound riders were waiting. They boarded. I carried them downtown. At the transit center, I parked and walked to the inbound arrival zone. There was no other bus. The 414 inbound, if it existed, would have arrived here 20 minutes ahead of me. There was nothing. No bus. No passengers. No indication that anything had arrived. I checked the fleet tracking system on my phone. Every bus in the Metro regional fleet is GPS tracked in real time. The only bus on the 414 route that night was Unit 2917. Mine. There was no second bus. I drove back to the yard. I sat in the bus. I thought about what I had seen. A second bus meant a second driver. A second driver meant I was not the only one. Someone else was running this route, someone I couldn't identify, in a bus I couldn't track, carrying passengers I couldn't count, on a schedule that matched mine. I was not alone on the 414. I had never been alone on the 414. The route had been running this whole time, and my assessment trips had simply allowed me to see what was already in service. This realization landed in me not as fear but as something quieter and heavier. Relief, maybe, or its opposite. If the route was already running, had always been running, then my decision to drive it wasn't the thing that brought the passengers into existence. They were already there. They had been waiting at Southgate and Wren since 2019. When the service was cut, they had been standing in perfect boarding formation, holding their fare cards, adjusting their weight from foot to foot, checking down the road for the bus that didn't come for 5 years. Every night, in the cold and the rain and the heat, waiting. And now I came, and the doors opened, and they got on, and for 47 minutes they were riders on a bus, going where they needed to go. And then the bus reached the end of the line and they got off and walked away, and the next night they were back at the stop. I need to tell you what happened in March, and then I'm going to tell you where things stand now, and then I'm going to stop, because there's a limit to what I can say, and I think I'm close to it. In March, the planning department released its dormant route reactivation report. Of the 12 dormant routes assessed, 3 were recommended for pilot reactivation. The 414 was not among them. The report cited infrastructure costs, low projected ridership, and the availability of alternative trunk line service along part of the corridor. The Southgate residential grid, the report acknowledged, remained underserved by the current network, but a demand-responsive shuttle pilot was recommended as a lower-cost alternative. A demand-responsive shuttle is not a bus route. It doesn't run on a fixed schedule. It doesn't have designated stops. You request it through an app, and it comes to your location. There is no Stop 12. There is no Southgate and Wren. There is no shelter with a bench where a man in a dark jacket sits and waits for the bus he takes to his transfer point 5 nights a week. The report was final. The 414 would not be reactivated. Keely told me the assessment runs were no longer authorized. The budget line was closed. She thanked me for my thorough work. She said the planning department had specifically noted the quality of my infrastructure documentation. I went back to my regular rotation. The 30, the 22, familiar routes, familiar stops, familiar faces, revenue service, real passengers, real weight, real fare cards, real cameras, real everything. I drove, and I was good at it, and I didn't think about the 414 during work hours. After work, I thought about nothing else. Here is what I did. I'm not going to justify it because I don't think justification is possible, and I'm not sure it's necessary. I'm just going to tell you what I did. I began driving the 414 route in my personal car, every Wednesday night, off the clock, in my own vehicle, on my own time. I drove the 9.7 miles from the transit center to the park and ride, following the exact route, stopping at every designated stop for 15 seconds, then continuing. I drove at service speed. I didn't announce the stops because I was in a Honda Civic and there was no PA system and no automated voice, but I stopped at every stop. I stopped and I waited, and then I drove on. The stops were empty. I knew they would be. My car was not a bus. The passengers were not waiting for a Civic. They were waiting for the 414, for the blue and white livery and the opening doors and the voice that said their stop's name. I was the wrong vehicle and the wrong shape and the wrong everything, and the stops were empty. And I drove the route in the dark every Wednesday and nothing happened, and I went home. This continued for 3 weeks. On the 4th Wednesday, I was approaching Stop 12, Southgate and Wren. I slowed down even though there was no operational reason to slow down, because I was in my car and there was no stop-and-wait procedure for a Honda Civic. But I slowed. I pulled to the curb on Southgate Boulevard, in the bus stop zone, and I stopped. The shelter was there. The bench was there. The sign was there. Route 414, Southgate and Wren. The light cast its circle. The bench was empty. I sat there in my car with the engine running and the heater on, And I looked at the empty stop and I thought about the man in the dark jacket. I thought about where he was going, the transfer at stop 9, the route 22, wherever the 22 took him. I thought about the woman with the stroller and the child who fell asleep on the outbound run. I thought about the workers in boots and the older women in the back and the man with the briefcase who got off at stop 15 and walked toward the dark office building with his keys in his hand. I thought about what Keely had said. The route was discontinued because ridership dropped below the viability threshold. Those people didn't stop needing to get where they were going. We just stopped taking them. I pulled away from the stop. I drove the rest of the route. Empty. All of it empty. I went home. The next morning, Thursday, I called Keely. I asked about the process for proposing a service change. Not a reactivation, not a dormant route pilot, but a new service proposal from a driver. She said there was a form. She said it went through the union representative to the service planning committee. She said it almost never resulted in action, but the form existed and I was welcome to fill it out. I filled it out. I proposed a limited night service on the 414 corridor, Wednesday and Friday nights, 1 outbound and 1 inbound run per night, 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. I cited the infrastructure assessment data, the intact shelters, the functional signage, the road conditions that were deteriorating but repairable. Under projected ridership, I wrote a number that I knew was accurate and that I could not defend, 65 to 70 per round trip. The form was acknowledged. It entered the system. It would be reviewed, Keely said, at some indeterminate future date. I continued driving the route in my car every Wednesday. The stops were always empty. I stopped anyway. In April last week, I was driving the route in my car. Wednesday night, stop 12. I pulled to the curb and stopped. The shelter, the bench, the sign, the light, empty. I turned off the engine. I'd never done that before. I'd always kept the car running, as if the 15-second dwell time applied and I'd be pulling away. But that night I turned off the engine and I sat there in the silence. No heater, no fan, no idle, and I looked at the empty stop. It wasn't empty. The man in the dark jacket was sitting on the bench. He was sitting the way he always sat, weight slightly forward, hands on his knees, the posture of a man who has been waiting and is prepared to wait longer. He was looking down the road, the direction the bus would come from. Not at me. Not at my car. Down the road. I watched him. He didn't move. He sat, and he waited, and the road stayed empty and no bus came. I don't know how long I sat there. A long time. Long enough that the cold crept into the car and I could see my breath. Long enough that my hands got stiff on the steering wheel. Long enough that the man on the bench shifted his weight once, the way you do when you've been sitting on a hard surface and your body demands a small adjustment. He was waiting. I started the car. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen in the dark. This is what I know. The 414 has passengers. They are waiting at the stops. Tonight. Right now. The way they have been waiting since the route was cut. They are not ghosts, because ghosts are the dead, and I don't think these people are dead. I think they are riders. I think they are the permanent, irreducible residue of a transit need that was created when the route was built and was not destroyed when the route was discontinued. The system made a promise. It put up signs. It built shelters. It ran buses. It said, "Stand here and we will come for you." And then the system broke the promise, and the riders are still standing where they were told to stand, holding the fare cards they were told to hold, waiting for the service they were told would come. I think they have always been there. I think every dormant route in every transit system has them patient, invisible, waiting in perfect formation at stops that the city has forgotten. I think the only thing unusual about the 414 is that someone drove the route and opened the doors. I am going to keep driving the route, in my car, on Wednesday nights, stopping at every stop. The stops are empty when I do this. My car is not a bus, and they are not waiting for a car. But I stop anyway. I stop, and I wait for 15 seconds, and I look at the shelter and the bench and the sign, and then I drive to the next stop and I do it again. I am going to keep filing the service proposal. Every month. Through the union, through the committee, through whatever channel exists. I am going to cite ridership numbers that I cannot prove and that no instrument will ever confirm. I am going to recommend reactivation until someone reactivates the route or tells me to stop. And if they tell me to stop, I am going to keep driving it on Wednesdays. Because here is what I understood, sitting in my cold car at Southgate and Wren, watching a man wait for a bus that isn't coming. The horror is not that they are there. The horror is that we told them to wait and then we left. The horror is that the system made them into riders and then the system took the bus away and they are still riders. Because that is what we made them, and they will stand at those stops in boarding formation with their fare cards out until someone comes. And the worst part, the part I sit with in my kitchen at 3 in the morning, the part that I can feel settling into my bones, the way the cold settled into my car, is that I don't know if I'm trying to help them or if I'm becoming one of them. Because every Wednesday night at 11:40, I am standing at a curb in the dark, waiting for something that the system has decided will not come. And I am holding my position, and I am not leaving, and the only difference between me and the man in the dark jacket is that I can still see myself doing it. I can still see myself doing it. I don't know for how much longer.